Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs here at National History Day. We know that this is the time of year where many of our students are developing, refining, and editing those gosh darn big exhibit boards to get them ready for NHD contests. And you might have contests going on at your school level, at the regional level, getting ready to go to an affiliate contest, or possibly even this year, the NHD National Contest in June. We know that exhibits are the biggest category in almost every contest everywhere. So what we're going to do today is spend a little time to ask an NEH expert to get some tips on building exhibits from somebody who does so professionally. So we've got two guests with us today. We've got Marcy Raven from the New York Historical Society, and we have Whitney Olson, who's our NHD in California co-coordinator. And they're both going to have lots of great tips and suggestions that you can use. But before we get started, I want to turn things over to my colleague at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Julia Wynn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lynn, and welcome to our Ask the NEH Expert video series. Before we get started and turn to the real experts, I want to take just a minute to tell you a little bit about NEH, who we are and what we do. The National Endowment for the Humanities is a federal grant-making agency. We fund research, preservation, and education in the humanities, and certainly history is an important part of the humanities. NEH supports a wide range of activities, including the creation of documentary films, the writing of books and articles, and of course, museum exhibitions. NEH has a long history with National History Day. We've supported History Day since its founding in the 1970s, and we continue to support the first prize NEH Scholar medals at the national contest. We also have a special prize that we support for excellent use of the historic newspapers found in Chronicling America. If you don't know about Chronicling America, it is a collection of over 11 million pages of digitized historic American newspapers housed on the Library of Congress website. And it is a fantastic resource for NHD teachers and students. We also have Edcitement, which is our education website. Edcitement is also a key resource for teachers and students. It has hundreds of lesson plans, student activities, links to websites that have been vetted by scholars and teachers. It also has features developed specifically for National History Day, as well as lesson plans using Chronicling America. One other resource that we have available to teachers are the summer programs. Every year, NEH offers dozens of professional development programs for teachers in the summertime, and this gives teachers from all over the country the opportunity to study a variety of humanities topics in depth. You can find information about all of this on our website, NEH.gov, and it's a great place to explore our resources and the types of projects that we fund. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Marcy Raven. Marcy is Vice President for History Exhibitions at the New York Historical Society. She's responsible for curating many of the history exhibits that the New York Historical Society puts on. These exhibits draw on New York Historical Society collections, but also use materials from many other sources. And Marcy has a PhD in history. So welcome, Marcy, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Well, a lot of times our students get to a point, I'm sure you've probably gotten to this point too, where they've done a lot of research and they know an awful lot about their topic, but they're trying to figure out how they go about starting to figure out how to put this in an exhibit format. Can you talk a little bit about what you need to do when you start planning for an exhibit, once you kind of have an idea of what your topic's about?
Sure. I actually think that's one of the hardest stages. So it's one that no matter how much experience you have, you just have to figure out your way through it. And there's no really one right way. But the way I tend to do it is that I like to start with my story. What is it that I really need to communicate? Where am I going to begin the story? Where am I going to end the story? All those decisions actually take a lot of thought, because anything that you have to say which is worth saying is probably probably constitutes a larger subject than you can easily put into an exhibit. So you have to find what your through line is and what it is that, how it is you're going to turn it into a story or a presentation for your audience. So actually, audience is an important thing to think about here. Who is it that you'll be expecting to see your show? How much do they know about the topic already, or how much, or how little do they know about it? Because those kinds of thinking about those questions will help you know which parts of the story are really important to convey. And since words are really limited, all of us have to think about how to limit our words and the amount of content we include in an exhibit. You want to spend a lot of time thinking about what's key for your group. Another thing that I do right at the beginning is I think about how I'd like to vary my focus. So once I know the story, once I have a sense for beginning, middle, and an end, I think about whether I don't want to make the mistake of only doing too much overview and not enough individual focus on topics. It's more interesting for people if you combine the broad story and the deep story. So right now I'm working on an exhibit about the Vietnam War. So I'd like to make sure that people have a sense of the breadth of the war, about the many different things that went on during the war, but also some sense of who the individuals were on all sides of the conflict, and what their concerns were, their fears, their hopes, those kinds of things. So you always want to try to balance out between the broad and the deep. And then I guess the last thing to just bring up at the beginning is, besides for words and besides for story, well, actually, let me re-say that. Part of the story is images and objects. So just like in a film, it's not just about dialogue, it's also about the images and the drama that you're conveying in the acting. In an exhibit, you want to make sure that you're not just relying on words to tell your story, but thinking about the images, thinking about what small or large objects you can bring in to help anchor your story is also really key.
Well, I think those are some really good suggestions, because I think exhibits are very much a visual medium. But I think you raised a really good point about, we use the term historical context with our students. You have to understand that the event that you're portraying in your exhibit board didn't just magically happen, that things happened to set it up. Let me kind of take this a step further and talk about design. So once you kind of narrow down what are the objects and what are the stories you want to focus on, how do you start looking at the idea of planning and designing an exhibit board kind of from a visual point of view?
Right. Design is really key. It's actually one of the things that I think makes exhibit creation the most fun for the creator, and also it really makes it sing for the audience. What design does is that it shapes how your audience is going to perceive your exhibit. So you're not just creating a book, and you don't want to just put a book up on the wall. You want to give it some kind of shape and texture and feel, and that's where design comes in. So I think about design from the very beginning of my process. I don't wait to have all of my story elements figured out and then start thinking about design. I actually try to do them together. And it's a little bit more complicated that way because you're working back and forth from history, story, content to design, and then back again. But it makes for a stronger project, and it allows you to use your design to help carry some of the storytelling elements that you need to convey. So if you're limited in the number of words you can use, if you're limited in the space, then you can use your design to help convey some of the aspects of that story and condense and engage and enliven it for people. So the other thing to think about is that as important as design is, and as much as it can help you clarify the story, it can also cause confusion if you don't take care to keep your design clear and legible. So you don't want to have too much design. And trying to figure out what's too much and what's not enough is always something that's a little tricky. And, you learn with experience and you do the best you can at any given moment. But I guess it's good to keep in mind that if your design clouds the meaning of your story, or if it prevents your audience from understanding, either being able to read or understanding the point, then you've got too much design going on. And it's probably good to just go to museums or exhibits anywhere in any institution and see how people are presenting their information. And you decide if you think that particular style is too much design or too little design, or could they have done something better. It's really a very kind of easy and cheap way to get a good training in exhibit making is to go to other museums. A couple of other thoughts about design is that when I'm working with, I try to use as many tools as I can to convey experience and emotion and feeling. And so color, for example, is something you can use to convey emotion and feeling. Another thing you can do is if you're working with photographs, you can vary the size of your photographs. So are you working with close-ups? Are you looking at a medium shot, which is probably what I'm probably right now I'm probably a medium shot to you right now. If you were closer up on my face, I'd be a close-up. And if you were seeing my whole office, I'd be in long shot. So if you have if you're working with multiple photographs, it's interesting for the viewer and the audience if you vary the view. The other thing that I always do in design and planning is I always go to the space that I'm working in. I never just try to sit behind my computer and plan everything. I go to the space, I look at how people are likely to move through the space. I try to imagine what my boards are going to look like on that space. And I print out my exhibit boards in advance so that I can actually maybe just tape them to the walls and stand in front of my boards and see what they're going to look like. All of us do that, no matter how many exhibits we've done or no matter how much experience we have. It's really hard to imagine in your brain what something's going to look like. It's really much better to try to do a mock-up, even if it's really rough, and put it up on the wall and see if my lettering is big enough for people to read when they're standing in front of it. See how the colors look in the light in that room, that kind of thing.
Well, I think those are some really good points, because essentially our students are doing with the space of about a tabletop what you do with a couple of rooms. And I really like the point you brought up about going to visit a local exhibit, because every town has some kind of museum. And it's always a good idea to go through to see what you like and what you don't. Now, here's a question. We get a lot of questions about how to make something visually appealing, because like you said, you don't want a book up on a board because that's really pretty awful. And, let's be honest, think about the last time you were at a museum. You're not going to read all of it. So what are some suggestions that you could give them to help make the boards visually appealing with, like you said, not going overboard? Because sometimes I've seen some of those boards. There's lights and there's sirens and there's things that flash. And I'm so caught up in the lights, I didn't really know what the thesis was or what the evidence was. So what are some suggestions to make something visually appealing without going overboard?
I think one of the key things is to start your work in advance so you have an opportunity to revise it. I try to make sure that I leave myself enough time to do as many drafts as possible, especially if something is going to be put up, especially when I need to make sure that it works visually. So one thing to keep in mind is that the craft of telling a story and the craft of presenting a story visually are actually different crafts. They're different tasks. And so you need to allot enough time and do your best with both. One doesn't automatically lead to success in the other. So I start early. I allow myself time to try out a strategy, and then if I find that it's not working, if it's too busy and too overwhelming, then I can pull back and reduce some of the complexity. I also really rely on my team members. So we always work in teams, in small groups of people or large groups. And it's very important or very useful to get someone who's not on your team to look at what you've done and see if they can make sense of it. And if they can make sense of it, and if they're telling you the truth, then chances are you'll have a good read on whether something is working or not. Another strategy is to think about hierarchy of information and of visual material. So decide what you think is the most important thing for your audience to take from any kind of exhibit board. And then think about how you want to emphasize that. You know, maybe it's the size of the font, the lettering, maybe it's the size of the image, or maybe it's backgrounding it with another color so that it stands out. Again, keeping in mind to not make it so confusing that people can't read it, but to give your viewer a cue as to what you think is most important by using the design tools you have to emphasize that. Some other tips, tricks that we use all the time is to try to write in sentences that are as short as possible. So you don't want to have all of your sentences be so similar that they seem repetitive and kind of tedious for people to read. You certainly want to vary the flow and rhythm, but keep them as short as you can and write in active sentences. You know, no matter how many exhibits we do, we're still having to give ourselves those tips every time we start to write a script. It's hard. It's a tough discipline, and so you really have to try it more than once, you know, write a sentence more than once generally to get it to use active tenses of verbs and to keep it short. Speaking of short, the other thing we try to do is to keep the margins large on our boards. You know, don't run your words to the edge of the page. You know, leave white space around sentences. It helps the viewer tremendously. It's hard. All of us know how tough it is to stand in an exhibit and make our way through complex text. And so trying it yourself, you know, getting those words on a rough draft of your board, putting them up on the wall and stand there and read it out loud, see what it sounds like and how easy, and figure out how easy it is to read. Those will probably give you some good cues.
There's some really awesome tips, especially because our exhibit board designers are limited to only 500 student composed words. So all of those tips are really, really good. What I'd like to do is transition a little bit and bring in Whitney here to talk a little bit more about these NHD style exhibits. Can you talk a little bit about the space students can use both on their boards and off their boards? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do?
Well, so I think it's really mindful to keep in the idea of the space is a whole space, like the volume of your exhibit. So you can use the bottom of the exhibit as a great space to display information. It's easy to see. And you can go all the way up to the top to that 72 inches. But what you can't do is extend beyond or below. I think that students need to also remember that while all that space is available to use, they don't want to hide important information behind something that they're displaying. So the idea of mocking it up, like Marcy said, and looking at it is really important because you don't want to hide your most important text behind an artifact that's being blocked. Also, sometimes kids want to have like a 3D image on the side of their exhibit, which is fine, but they need to make sure that the board wings stay within that 30 inches, that things aren't extending out. The exhibits are going to be back-to-back, marching down tables, and you can't have part of one exhibit extending into the space for another exhibit.
Absolutely, and using that space creatively can be fun. Now let me ask you a question about multimedia. Students in this category can have up to 3 minutes of multimedia if they want. Do you recommend that? What kinds of ways have you seen it used effectively? And maybe what are some ways you maybe haven't seen it used as effectively?
Well, I like multimedia, and I think kids like tech. So it's a great way for them to marry things that they have a great affinity towards. But the multimedia piece should go towards evidence towards their claim of how their topic connects to the theme or why it's significant in history. So the kids need to remember, students need to remember that when they're doing a multimedia piece, if they have their own narrative in it, those words count against student-composed words. I think some great ways of using multimedia is if there's a news clip that, or part of an interview that they did, or if it was a protest movement and there's songs, they'd like people to hear the songs. Those are all great ways to bring in this multimedia. And it can get expensive. iPads are expensive, but I don't think you have to have a fancy iPad or a Bluetooth speaker to have an effective multimedia element. You can get small voice boxes and pre-record where your judges or your viewers push a button and listen to part of the speech that you might have the text next to it, or to get the tone of the way people were speaking. So multimedia, I think, is very effective, but it's not a chance to stand up and say why my exhibit is better than somebody else's. It's best used as a tool to continue the story and the analysis.
Well, I think that's a good point. There's lots of things you can do, but based on your project and your topic, you have to decide which ones you want to do, because multimedia sometimes works better with some topics than with others. And there's some where you're almost looking for it. Let me also ask a question. We get this a lot. Does your process paper have to be attached to your board? No. And I would say that a good practice at many competitions the students will leave a display copy. They'll actually mark display copy on the cover, and they'll leave it there. Sometimes there's no room to put a paper. They're going to be covering something at the bottom of their exhibit. They might, process papers attached to a board takes up space that you could be using to tell your story and for evidence. You only have so much space. And so you do not need and should not put the process paper or even transcripts of interviews. They're just pages and pages stapled together, because your judges are not going to have time to look at that in that manner. Okay, let's talk a little bit about these boards here for a second. A lot of our students use that kind of traditional trifold board. But I've seen, boxes and circles and globes and maps. What do you think about that, or what suggestions would you give students considering maybe an alternative shape board?
Well, I think the important thing is to consider your audience. So if the students are building their exhibit for a competition, they need to think about the judges. And the biggest thing that the judges have against their interaction with the exhibit is time. They're constricted by time, and they need to be able to see as much information as possible. So some of those more creative exhibits are beautiful, and they're great craftsmanship, but if you can't see all of the information, something might get missed. So I think when you're designing an exhibit, you need to make sure that you're not hiding important things, or there's something on the back side of the exhibit that the judge didn't know to look at. So if you need a roadmap, it might be too complicated or too creative. I think also the idea, I've seen exhibits that spin. I've seen exhibits with doors and shutters and very creative uses of inexpensive items. And again, you just need to make sure that there's no information hidden that a judge can't see. Sometimes the creativity, though, comes in, even in a trifold board, make your wings a little bit longer, but set your tone with your color and your font. Is it readable? Does it set the tone that matches the topic? And that's a way to do creativity that's inexpensive. It gets the feeling of the topic across, but it isn't so complex that the judges miss the point of your exhibit.
Exactly. The bells and whistles can't take over. The only thing people are going to remember are the bells and whistles. Well, and I think it's another good tip too. Remember, students, these have to travel. These have to go with you if you're going to go to a contest. So you need to make sure that they can get there. So that's a good thing to chat with mom and dad about if you have one of these kind of crazy 3D ideas. It might be possible, and it might not be. So think about something that can be broken down or disconnected relatively easily. I actually want to turn things back to Marcy here and ask you a question. One of the things that, kind of bridging off of that our students try to do is to make, an ability to interact with the exhibit. Can you give some tips or suggestions for students thinking about that and ways that your team tries to make your exhibits interactive?
The interaction is a really useful thing to try to encourage in an exhibit. People just seem to learn better when they're able to physically engage somehow with the exhibits. Some of the tactics that we might use, I'm hearing from Whitney, might not be as possible given what the judges in your contests and your competitions are looking for, so it doesn't sound like looking behind doors and peekaboo windows are the kinds of things you want to do. But maybe one thing we're using in an exhibit that we're in, the Vietnam War exhibit that we're working on right now, is a large mural where we're presenting different scenes. Now, I know that this isn't something you wouldn't be working with large murals, but sometimes if you think about a Where's Waldo kind of strategy, where you actually ask people to look for a scene or look for a character in a scene or look for some kind of object or word, at least you're bringing them in, you're drawing them in. So it's kind of any kind of strategy that you can use to draw people in might help. Another thing that we do is when we can't use real artifacts for one reason or another, we use props. So maybe it's a paperback book, or maybe it's a baseball, or any kind of small object that could be attached to a board that isn't valuable and doesn't have to be protected by a case, but it gives some dimensionality to the presentation and kind of connects the presentation to real life or to something which is visual and imaginable by the audience member, might help.
Last question from Marcy here. I just want to ask, what do you think is so cool about building exhibits? What's your favorite part? I think it's important for students to hear that. What do you like to do with it?
Right. I think what I love doing is creating the stories, but also using many different mediums, many different media to try to tell those stories. So I get to work with film and design and arrange elements in space and audio, multimedia. I can use almost any mode of conveyance that exists out there to try to tell my stories. And so for me, it's the combination of working with the content and the various different kinds of artistic or oral or visual media, and then imagining how all of that creates an experience for a visitor and perhaps brings them to a different time and place. That's, for me, what's the most interesting.
Excellent. Whitney, I want to turn a question to you. This is a question we get a lot. Do you have to spend a lot of money to create a really good exhibit?
No. I don't think you do. I think that when you're creating a really good exhibit, you need to answer a couple of questions. Number one, can I transport it, which you already brought up? And number two, can I carry it, especially if I'm an individual? But I think that some of the best choices you can make when you're creating an exhibit is to spend your time and your money on the things that are going to matter the most. And so $100 on really intricate trim wood that goes around the outside of your exhibit is going to look beautiful, but is it the best best use of the money in terms of what you might, maybe you get a better glue or use thicker paper or a paper cutter, spend some money on color images, because the board is the bones, but the story itself is going to come through the quotes and the images and the artifacts that you use. And so I don't think it costs a lot of money to build the boards. Great exhibits are going to be well organized and visually appealing and draw you in. And that doesn't take a lot of money to do a 3-sided exhibit. That said, an element of an exhibit that stands up straight, that has enough space so that you can read the words. Those are all important things. So you need to think about that when you're putting your exhibit or deciding how big your exhibit is going to be and what you're going to make it out of.
One of my favorite exhibits last year used popsicle sticks. Truly, some of the most basic materials, but it was one of my favorites. It was very simple, but was very well done, and it made sense with the story they were telling. Let me ask you a question too. What's something that you see kind of from the coordinator point of view or from a judge point of view that sometimes students forget on an exhibit board? What's the biggest mistake you see?
I think that if I was to bring down to one biggest mistake is that they have to, well, the simple most biggest mistake I see that students do is they don't use a large enough size font. And they put a 6-foot tall board on top of a table and they have size 12 font at the top and their judges can't read it. So they can have fantastic information and amazing analysis, but if as a judge I can't read it, judge it. And so that would be the number one thing. And I think the other thing would be that a well-told story, you have to make choices, as Marcy said, and you can't put everything on there. You have to make choices about what how you're organizing your information and how you're breaking it down. And those are really important, and that's why a mock-up is so important.
Well, I think those are fabulous tips. I'm going to throw one other thing in there. Students, if you have an odd-shaped exhibit board or need a certain thing, please contact your coordinator before you get to the contest. That's really important. I was helping a group of students last year. They needed to have a corner. They didn't have one. We had to do a lot of shuffling. So if you've got a weird situation, trust me, our coordinators all over the country are awesome. They want to help you, but just make sure you contact them before the morning of the contest. Alrighty, well, this is really, really wonderful information. Thank you so much to both of you for your tips. And to wrap things up, I'm going to turn things back over to Julia.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks to our presenters today. I just want to remind you that NEH offers a variety of resources for NHD students and teachers, Chronicling America, Excitement, professional development programs for teachers. And finally, don't forget about your State Humanities Council. Many of the state councils are very heavily involved in National History Day, and all of them can be a great resource to you in developing and revising your National History Day project. So definitely get in touch with your state councils as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and good luck with your NHD projects this year.